I'm over that shit, wait.
Let's go. Yes, sir.
Cause I said loyalty, that makes me family. About my royalties, I'm catching casualties. They been ignoring me, I turn them casually. They be up in my skin, that's what I'm glad to be. They ain't never show no love, but they never gave a fuck. Tryna love the wrong people, I done got my heart fucked. Had to go a long journey just so I could write this book. You did me wrong, I want revenge. I'ma show you how I look. You done turned me to a beast, yeah. It's time to eat, I'm a dog who doesn't flee, yeah. You wasn't lead, I done drive across the country, I done drive across the sea. And I promise that I'm going places you can never be. And I promise that I'm going places you can never be. And when I struggle by my lonely people act like they ain't see what's surrounded by non-believers. Promise I'ma make them see. You can't stop me from balling, and I don't even need no keys. So switch it up, can't waste my time, so I'll live it up. You love that girl, don't give up. I done made my move like T-Tac, so I'ma take my bag, I got my own. I know you critics and all you hoes. Promise that you would've done more. Why the way to say next man you hoes? You want my time, it's a price for sure. I think by the time I spend there, if I made it, all I see is mistakes. Think about the some of the people I love and I trust, and all I see is mistakes. I see the way the people be living in the moon, I swear to God I can relate. I can't so many people, I love my doors, and put the shit back in my face. Tryna love the wrong people, I done got my heart for. I ain't going long journey just so I can write this book. They ain't never show no love, but they ain't never gave a fuck. Tryna love the wrong people, I done got my heart for. I ain't going long journey just so I can write this book. You did me wrong, I want revenge. I'ma show you how I look. You done turned me to a beast, yeah. It's time to eat, I'm a dog who doesn't flee, yeah. You want to leave, I done travel across the country, I done travel across the sea. And I promise that I'm going places you can never be. Cause I said loyalty, that makes me family. All by my royalties, I'm catching casualties. They been ignoring me, I turned them casually. To be up in my skin, that's where I'm glad to be. I'm glad I'm me and not you, cause that would drop your sucker too. I'm so sick that blue can't fix it. Go buy your copy, you put me in this shit. Wait if now what you wasn't saying. And don't you dare mention my name, I'm fuck with you. You think I'm fuck with you, I'm done trying to buy what's up with you. Cause honesty, that means a lot to me. I spoke so highly of you, you hurt the pride of me. So now you dead to me, and that's how it's gotta be. Cause I don't ask so much, just please don't lie to me. Cause I said loyalty, that makes it family. About my royalties, I'm catching casualties. They been ignoring me, I touch the casualty. Could be up in my skin, that's what I'm glad to be. They ain't never show no love, but they ain't never gave a fuck. Tryna love the wrong people, I done got my heart fucked. Ain't to go a long journey just so I can write this book. You did me wrong, I want revenge. I'ma show you how I look. You done turned me to a beast, yeah. It's time to eat, I'm a dog who doesn't flee, yeah. You want to leave, I done travel across the country, I done travel across the sea. And I promise that I'm going places you can never be. I think by the time I spend the effort I made, and all I see is mistakes. Think my soul and the people I love and I trust, and all I see is mistakes. I see the way the people be living in the moon, I swear to God I can relate. I done get so many people I love my Lord, they threw the shit right in my face. I'm gone.